I am very excited today to have Will Pamment, co-founder of SimConverse, with me on the podcast today. And some of you are familiar with my joke. He's actually in Australia, so he is coming to us from the future. Hi, Will.
Hi, Andrea. How are you?
Good. And the future in more than one way, because we'll get into it pretty soon. But SimConverse is, really, I think may have been the first company that I was aware of generative AI. I felt like I was learning about generative AI from SimConverse before it blew up and was everywhere.
Yeah. I think that's about right. We've been doing this just under 5 years now, and I know ChatGPT has been kind of blew onto the scene at the start of last year. So I think you probably knew about it before a lot of people knew about it. So it's a good achievement.
Well, you knew about it before a lot of people. So what we'd like to start with on the podcast is really what's your origin story. This season of the podcast is focused on healthcare change makers, and I truly feel that SimConverse is a very innovative product and has the potential to, well, it's already happening for the organizations you work with, change healthcare. So who is Will Pamment, and how did you come to co-found SimConverse?
Yeah. Okay. So, an introduction of me for the audience. So my background is semi-medical, and you'll understand why I introduce myself as that nowadays. But I started kind of my research and academic career. I did a Bachelor of Science with honours and in cardiothoracic surgery at the University of Melbourne. I then, after that, moved up to Sydney. So if anyone knows the geography of Australia, it's 8.5 hours north to Sydney. And in Sydney, where I started my MD, and which is a medical doctorate for us over here, and concurrent PhD. My PhD, the research focus area was in clinical communication theory, looking at how we can increase accessibility of communication skills training for the healthcare workforce. That and the MD, we were, I think, second year of our medical program, and Aidan, who's my co-founder, and I kind of got together and said, we're not really getting enough of the communication training that we were hoping for. We need something that basically for us to practice for our skills. We put something together very quickly. Aidan's technically brilliant, and I had all the education background, so we kind of knew roughly where we wanted to go to start with and build this thing for ourselves. Realized our friends want to use it, so then our friends use it. Realized that the universities in the area and the hospitals in the area wanted to use it, so started kind of actually making a thing out of it and making it into a product rather than just something for two guys to use in their dorm room. And then realized that we couldn't do all of that at the same time as doing, at least for me, a double degree in Aidan, the MD. So took a year off. Things really took off very quickly for us. This is back in 2018. Things really took off very quickly for us on home soil in Australia and Asia Pacific. But then we moved over to doing some work in the UK by the end of the first year. Realized actually we should give this a proper go. At the end of the first year, Sid was kind enough, and Stuart Lane, who we'll be setting up with later in the year actually, Stuart Lane was kind enough to give us another year off with the MD faculty's approval. And come the end of that year, we had just set up with our first NHS and a few early US organizations, the hospitals and universities, and realized that we had to probably put our time into this permanently. So we've then been doing this for the last, I think, coming up on 5 years now. So that's sort of my background. A bit circuitous. The thing that I mentioned in there that is kind of what I do day to day and focus on a lot is a lot more around the consulting and the kind of helping organizations understand how to use AI appropriately and where communication skills training can be delivered probably more effectively, but also certainly more easily at large scale, because that wasn't something that was really possible before the advent of generative AI and systems like SimConverse. A bit of a long answer, but I hope that gives everyone the kind of detail about it too.
Oh, it's absolutely fantastic. So just to recap, you were on the MD PhD route, and then really as SimConverse has taken off, would you say you're firmly out of that path now and on the entrepreneur side? Like, where are you in that part of the journey?
It's interesting. I'm kind of in and out of it. I'm very much on my day to day. I'm firmly in the. I don't usually call myself the entrepreneur, but I mean, I'm firmly in that camp. Definitely. My partner, she's medical. All of my friends are medical because we all went through the MD program. So I'm firmly on the business side, but everything around me is medical. And the majority of my time is spent in hospitals or in universities, kind of talking through and helping people on board for a lot of their new training needs.
That's amazing. I think that is a great message. You know, we have medical students and other people that listen to the podcast, and, you know, it's okay to explore your calling. And we never can predict sometimes. You know, when I think back on my own career, and you and I share simulation in common, I didn't even really know what simulation was when I went to medical school. And, you know, now it's a big part of my career and what I spend increasingly more time doing. So I think that's an important message, that it's okay to change gears and go down a different road. What I want to try to explain to our listeners, which, you know, we're in this podcast, mainly audio modality, if we can try to paint a picture, if you could, what is SimConverse?
Yeah, sure. So and by the way, if you asked me when I was 8 years old, all the way through to when I dropped out of medical school, if you asked me what I was going to do with my career, I would have told you I wanted to be a pediatric neurosurgeon. I was that kid. So it's a very left of field for me to be doing what I'm doing now. So yeah. So what is SimConverse? So what we do is large scale communication skills training. The way that we deliver that is via two main axes. One is alterations or assistance with pedagogy. So thinking around how we can actually change some of our communication training practices. That's a lot of what I spend my time doing, is kind of consulting around that. The other piece is technology. So when I say we do large scale communication skills training, specifically what I'm talking about is, now with the technology that we have, you have the opportunity to basically talk to a person. Now, it's not a real person, it's an AI generated person, and talk to them actively wherever you may be. As long as you have an internet connection, that's the quality of being able to send an email, or you can use a SimConverse platform. Talk to the platform, it talks back to you. You then get a suite of feedback after that interaction, which includes things like, yes, kind of the quantitative stuff. So did they, didn't they get the mark? But also the qualitative stuff, which, to be honest, I think is probably the most important part of what we do. The qualitative stuff is written feedback on how that specific learner can improve any individual kind of rubric item. If people want to see, they can have a look online, but that's the active learning component. The other component of what we do there is we actually fit within existing curricula. So you kind of actively learn, you're talking to the platform, you get a whole suite of feedback. You mentioned sim and simulation theories before. There's a lot of different sim theories that we kind of tie into. The key ones are around reflective practice. So after each one of those active interactions, learners need to reflect on their performance and explain how they might improve for next time. In this kind of safe to fail environment, learners would then go in and have an opportunity to go ahead and talk to the AI again, actually practice, actually do those things that they said they were going to do. So you get that really key psychomotor loop of, okay, I'm actually having the active conversation in a real-time way. It's not stilted. I don't have to phrase things in a specific way for the technology to understand me. It has a very powerful understanding of what's being said. And then from there, how does this align with my curriculum? So am I building up over time? Am I, to use an ed theory term, am I scaffolding that over time? For the audience who might not be familiar with that terminology, it's basically, am I building my learner up appropriately with these different scenarios as it relates to my curriculum? So think of it as like easier scenarios to start with, getting more difficult until you're very close to being ready for the real world. So SimConverse is then a platform that learners access from whatever device they have. They do their active training, and then they get a whole suite of feedback to be able to improve for future.
It's a remarkable product. And, I think the first time I saw it, I was skeptical, like anybody else would be, that, how good will this be? Would you say that it's like, for the purpose of this conversation, the patient that you're interacting with, should we call them the avatar, or what terminology would you use?
That's relatively accurate. There's a lot of work around visual avatars. If they're low fidelity, they're distractors from the learning activity. You distract a learner from the key psychomotor loop. So that's usually what people refer to when they say avatars, is something kind of visually there in front of them that's kind of bobbing around and low resolution. That's not what we do. But you can think of them as like, avatar entities. Absolutely. By the way, I think educators should be skeptical of technology. It's easy to be sold on something or kind of marketed to, but unless you have seen something in the flesh, or unless you've sort of had an opportunity to see how something works, just frankly, you probably shouldn't just knee-jerk believe that the thing does what someone has said it, especially with AI. There's a lot of misinformation in the market, particularly in the sim market, around, and education in general, around what AI can and can't do. And then people lean either way. It's just there are some pretty key things that it's essentially very powerful for, but there are also quite a lot of things that it's not very good at all. I think that knee-jerk reaction is the appropriate one to take, and I would say for any of the listeners who are kind of evaluating AI technology at the moment and how they might use it, they should be initially skeptical, but with the understanding that there is a huge potential if it's unlocked or used effectively.
So when someone logs into the SimConverse platform and they see a patient, they actually see the patient and they talk to the patient just like they would be in actual clinical environment, and the patient responds like patients do. And it's different than, some of us are old enough when we did our board exams, actually our USMLEs in the United States. There was essentially, you would type in a question and then a response would come back to you. This isn't like that at all. The patient's actually talking to you. Is anything else you want to add to kind of paint the picture for the listener?
Yeah, that's pretty spot on. There's a slight caveat for people when they go through and they see SimConverse in action is we focus on verbal and paraverbal communication. So what you say and how you say it. That's what we specifically focus in on as far as communication is concerned. There's a lot of evidence as to why. Something that we do consistently is think about how do we structure this in the best way for the learner rather than kind of what's easiest from technology. So we focus on what you say and how you say it, because it's that key kind of psychomotor loop for communication, which is what am I going to say and how should I deliver this information? Everything else kind of builds on top of that. So that's what we focus on. The reason I'm mentioning that is that the avatars themselves are AI generated visually. They are images of people. You can have a whole suite of, could be many thousands of different scenarios, and they can all look totally different. They can also all sound totally different because we AI generate our voices as well. So when we talk about representation of diversity and things for the audience, it's something that we had to solve a very long time ago, but absolutely you can with the SimConverse platform. So me as a learner, I log in. I would be using this through whatever education system I currently have. So we do a lot of deep integrations into platforms. So it makes it really easy for educators and learners to just log in, use SimConverse, do the assignments that they've been set. And then when I'm saying I'm doing my assignment, I sit down, I talk to the computer or my device. It might be an iPad, it might be a tablet, it might be my phone if I don't have access to either of those. I speak with a patient, a family member, or a colleague. Doesn't have to be that as well. It could also be if I'm doing some kind of leadership and management type scenario. Just I'm talking to someone and call them the avatar. And then I get all my feedback and I go back in and I act on that and I improve for next time. So you saw one of those more kind of OSCE style scenarios, which is like the objective structured clinical examination. That stuff for us is sort of the easy, almost bread and butter type stuff for AI. And the more interesting things that we do, or at least that's an opinion, the more interesting things that we do are around de-escalation, delivery of bad news, difficult conversations around things like safeguarding practices, domestic violence, even some really nuanced stuff around child abuse and things like that, because we control our own models. So there's a lot that we can do that's kind of unique to how we set up. But that's sort of as far as the learner is concerned, that's what my experience is. I go in there, I log in, I talk to it. As far as the educator is concerned, it gives you that diversity to basically have this be done asynchronously so that you're not having to spend the same amount of time as you would currently on those exercises.
Does the technology detect nonverbal communication? Can it tell the way I'm looking at the computer, or does it provide any of that type of feedback?
So we can do that internally. We don't for a few key reasons. So when I say we can do that, we know exactly what would be required to be able to do that. The reasons that we don't, there's kind of two main ones. So we work in government and military. So there's a lot of applications where that kind of recording of conversation or that kind of information, call it, being shared with the internet isn't allowed. So we've kind of got a cybersecurity limitation there. The other is actually accessibility. So anyone who's worked in the space of communication training, or anyone who's tried to do things like this before, you'll know that existing platforms are very, very slow, not just in the response, but also in the way that they operate, even if they're run on a very strong computer. We're built so that learners can access this from whatever device they have with them at home, kind of at the point of training, so to speak. Because of that requirement, what it means is that learners need to be able to access this from a low quality device with a low quality internet connection. The more information that you try and have the platform or you have the device send over the internet, the more difficult it is for that information to get across, and the slower that information gets across. So the poorer the learning experience for the students. So there's kind of two main things, just to summarize my answer for that. The first is that there's some cybersecurity reasons why we can't launch that at the minute. We're about to get our SOC 2 compliance. So there are some things that we get to change when we get to that stage, but that's one key thing. And the other is the accessibility piece, which I think is going to stay with us for the longer time, which is we need to be able to be used by a device that can't do nonverbal communication tracking, which is what we're talking about. And an equally 3D rendering of visual avatars. That's one of the reasons why we don't do it. Aside from just the quality of currently available models, it also makes it very inaccessible as far as the training is concerned, because you need either a strong desktop computer to be able to run that stuff, or you need a VR headset, which unfortunately very, very few people actually have access to. So it doesn't really solve a lot of the scale problems that we try and tackle at the minute.
There was something else that you mentioned, is you said that it detects what the clinician, the student is saying, but you also said it can detect tone, right? How they're saying it. And I know you, and I know that you care about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, we are having this conversation right now about AI, right? So I'm curious to what degree you can share, kind of explain or framework out how the technology ensures that tonal differences due to native languages or other racial, ethnic, to make sure that it's not, as an educator, I would be devastated if I found out that my, one group of students was getting more harshly critiqued by the AI assisted technology than another group of students. What I've been reading about AI is the world is biased, right? So if we program in content from the world, a lot of it ends up potentially being biased. We have all this data about the way, women physicians are treated. Is the patient, the SimConverse patient, going to be biased against, a woman physician or.
It's a good question. I'm sure it's one that the audience is thinking as well. There's three big things. So the first of all, I'll preface that the real answer to this is quite nuanced, but I'll do my best to kind of summarize the high level, because there are a few things that are important to understand as educators around how this technology works. I'm just going to summarize it up front so that I remember to get to them. The first is I'll talk about the technology and how it's actually trained. The second is I'll talk about the verbal and paraverbal piece and how that stuff is actually delivered and kind of transcription and everything around that. And then the third is subject matter and content. When we talk about diversity and inclusivity, that's a really important thing to live back to. So three kind of things: tech, the closer to pedagogy, and then the final piece being content. For the tech, so how does this stuff work? Why is bias important? Why do hallucinations happen? All of that sort of juicy stuff that's in the media at the moment and just frankly is not being explained particularly well. The first piece is with AI. First of all, it's probably worthwhile clarifying and classifying what it is. So AI itself has been around for many, many years. The reason that everyone has seen such a surge recently is generative AI, or what's termed generative AI, has gotten to a level of fidelity where it's able to do specific tasks quite well. In some cases better than people, but certainly not in all cases. There's nowhere near general intelligence, but that's a new kind of AI. People who have been in the space or around technology will have seen things like regression modeling for cohort analysis, which is now being called AI. It's technically correct, but it's also now used as a bit of a marketing term. So that, just by the way, for the non-technical audience, if you've seen on your dashboards and things for learners, basically, and if a learner has done 2 or 3 activities over the course of a year, and then you've got some kind of statistical model of how they're performing versus their cohort, that's regression analysis. That's now used or framed in as AI. The other side of the coin, so there's quite a whole suite in between, but I'll kind of try and keep it relatively succinct for you. The other side of the coin is generative AI. So generative AI, I'll actually use ChatGPT as an example because they've done me a favor in the way that they've named the model. So GPT, the G stands for generative. So it is generating a response for you based on its understanding of the world or understanding of language. More specifically, I'll kind of correct myself on that. The second piece is P, so pre-trained. Now, this is a juicy thing, so I'll come back to this in a second. But the final piece is T, so transformer. The transformer is basically like call it the unit of software that enables generative AI to function. So it's kind of a thing. It was a key innovation or something that came out of Google. It needed to happen for generative AI to work. That's what the T stands for. So GPT basically explains how this stuff works. Generative generates a response for you based on its understanding of a language or the information that's been provided with in the past. And then the final piece, so I mentioned T being transformer, the final piece is P, so pre-trained. This is where the Internet of Language comes in, because the question is basically, okay, that is sort of structurally how AI is working. It's generating that response for you based on its understanding of a language. But what language or what information are you providing it with to understand said language? GPT and a lot of the other very large language models are trained on publicly available data sets, which is basically the internet. The issue with the internet is kind of 2 key things. The first is the internet is obviously a huge place, which means inherently from the ground up, you're training it on heaps of different information. For the AI model, the question then becomes, okay, I've seen all of this stuff. How do I know what's important when you ask me a question? And if you ask me that question and I don't know what's important, I'll give you a response. But as far as AI is concerned, importance is the same thing as real. So then we experience that as a hallucination. But as far as the AI is concerned, that's just the most likely response that it should give you based on what it's been trained on. So if you train on very large data sets, you always run into that risk of hallucination and non-standardization because you're training it on basically too much information for it to quote unquote understand. Now, there's a bit of research work into kind of how you might adapt that nowadays, but that's the key thing for us to understand as educators. The second piece is then the other issue of the Internet of Language. So the first is just it's a very large place. The other is more what you're lining up to, which is it's also a very bigoted and biased place. So if you train models on that bigotry and bias, how on earth can you expect them to behave the way that you want them to as an educator? So the answer is you can't. If you train on the Internet of Language, you always are fighting that bias. You're basically fighting against what you trained it on with different things that you might stack on top. That, by the way, is for anyone who's interested, OpenAI's money goes into two things. They're a brilliant company, by the way. I know it's being recorded, but this. OpenAI's money goes into two things. One is on the training of their models, and the other is on all of the infrastructure and everything on top. So when a new model comes out and you see people on the internet talk about how they break it and how they've got it to say biased things, that's what a lot of time and engineering is spent on, is basically trying to fight the really big model. The reason this is related to education, the reason I'm going into the detail here, is when we think about basically the physics of how these models work, I'm going to use it like a weird analogy, but I think it summarizes this relatively well. Think of those really large general purpose language models as almost this big blob in space. The activity that you want it to do when we talk about communication is a very small entryway or an exit for that big blob in space. And you're talking about trying to basically jam it through this little space, fighting it with all your energy that you possibly have to get it to do a very specific activity. But it's not designed to do that. However, if you apply the same techniques, so generative pre-trained transformers, if you apply the same kinds of techniques, not the exact same stuff, but similar, for a very specific task, call it response to an initial message, i.e. what SimConverse does with one of our models, then you can get it to be very effective and very specialized. So rather than fighting the model, it's already behaving the way that you want it to. Now, what this means is you can't train it on the Internet of Language. It's very difficult to actually do this stuff. So it's much easier said than done. But what it gives you as an educator is the kind of control over how the model behaves, as well as the ability to have some of these really nuanced conversations around cultural competency / safety, depending on where you are in the world, as well as different pieces around being able to be picked up and used for diversity of training. So bit of a long answer. I hope that was useful for people kind of listening in around how AI works. And I've kind of explained from the ground up some of the problems with this technology. If you know those from the outset, you can mitigate them very effectively. We've been doing that for years. To summarize that piece, that's how the responses are generated. That's how the models are working. The other piece is the input. So when I say responses, I'm also talking about feedback, by the way, not just when the AI is responding to your question, it's also the feedback. So we have a different AI model that does the feedback and the marking. When you talk to a platform, there's actually several different AI models that you talk to. It feels like you're talking to one, but there's a lot going on under the hood. The other piece that you asked me about is basically accents and paraverbal communication, things picked up by the platform. So for what we do, the paraverbal communication is one thing actually uniquely that we're able to do around the world. It is the ability to control both our transcription, because we had to build our own transcription model to be able to get the quality that we have, but also the tagging of tonality, speech pattern, inflection, those sorts of things. The way that this is picked up by the platform is if I'm talking to my device, there are kind of two things that the device is picking up. The first is the words that you're saying, but the second is the way in which those words are being said. I won't go too far into the details there because I don't know. I think I might lose some of the audience, but just from non-interest, but I'm happy to lead back to that. But the key thing is you actually need to build your own transcription model to be able to meet or understand the accents of the various different people who have to go through education and training. We needed to solve that problem very early on, because obviously being from Australia, everyone has different accents to us. And then even working throughout Asia, Europe, and North and South America, we had to very quickly solve that problem. The only way that we could solve it was by building our own technology to do so. So that's the input. The question is then kind of how do you mitigate or how do you control against bias for input? And the answer is you need to be able to correctly receive or identify information that is put in. And that is where you talk about having a transcript that can understand learners and things like that. The final thing on that is that the SimConverse platform has been shown to increase both confidence and competence for English as an additional language learners. That was some research done out of Western Sydney University and the University of Canberra. So that's kind of the end effect of all of these things that I've been talking about, is it does actually and has been shown to improve the quality of education for learners who are struggling with this stuff inherently.
I'm curious if you have any data or sense that the medical students coming through now, because they grew up in the digital era. I mean, we've heard about this, socially, that people don't meet in bars anymore. They meet on apps. They're unlikely to generate a conversation with a random stranger compared to, even 10 or 20 years ago. Are you seeing or hearing from medical educators that there is a gap in this generation, that they do need more training like this because they honestly aren't having as many conversations? I mean, I admit that when my phone rings, I'm like, oh my goodness, my phone is ringing. I have to have a conversation with this person. Why didn't they send a text? But it was very common to talk on the phone during my formative years. So I'm just curious if that's a real gap that's being seen, or, something that kids these days, it's really more of a bias I have than based in reality.
I think you're striking a really important point, which is more around kind of the effect of COVID on education and learning. There's a lot that happened to particularly early learners. And when I say early learners, I'm not talking about medical degree. I'm referring to kind of preschool type age, around the impact of COVID on their normal neurodevelopment. So like the honest expectation is that you would expect that would also be the case for basically anyone else developing, but the studies are a little bit less clear as you kind of get older and older. Anecdotally, I can tell you that it's a concern basically everywhere in the world, that their current, even new graduates who are going into the workforce. So we've been talking about medical, but just for anyone listening, we work quite extensively throughout healthcare. So medical is a key part, but to be honest, because there are more staff and more students, we do a lot more work in nursing and allied health as well. So we work across the gambit and across both the countries as well as the actual different specialties. I hear very consistently that not even just the educators complaining about the young generation, it's actually the students themselves feedback that they're less confident. It's kind of coming from both sides of the aisle, which puts more impetus on or more requirement for the staff to actually deliver this training, which makes it even more difficult when we understand that most people can't do this more than they already are, unless you look at using tech. So the short answer to your question is yes, I'm certainly seeing that, and I hear that anecdotally all the time. I also actually have seen that, again, anecdotally. It would be interesting to do a study on this. Last year, we ran a cross-sectional evaluation or validation study of SimConverse for 2023. We had a little over 12,000 respondents, which was great, really nice sample size, especially when anyone who's done qualitative research like I have in the past is used to having to try and make some power work. But we had a very big sample size, about 12,500 go through. And we saw that SimConverse significantly increased their confidence on the platform, as well as significantly increased their performance over time. And one of the key things that kept coming up in the qualitative feedback or the notes that we were receiving from learners as part of that study was, I don't feel confident in my communication. And the educators would feed back to us that didn't used to be the case, but certainly is now. So kind of drawing a few conclusions there, but it feels like there's certainly a correlation. which might imply causation. Who knows? I'll probably get into an intellectual argument with someone about that.
Yeah, and I don't want to, for my students and residents that listen occasionally, I'm not like shaking my fist and saying like, they should be better. Why can't you guys, respond to things the way, my generation or older did? Because one of the things I notice, honestly, is because they're more centered on patient safety and they're concerned about their ability to be a good doctor, be a good nurse, they have higher expectations for us. Like this generation actually does expect that their education will prepare them for these moments and that, they will get to do something in the simulation lab. They're actually not okay with see one, do one, teach one either, which is actually a good thing. I just think we're, as medical educators, we're caught in this situation right now where our generational experience was different. And then we don't necessarily have the resources to meet their needs. And I'm very much in the camp that you just mentioned that this is an example of how technology can start to bridge this, because we know healthcare dollars aren't expanding anywhere. And I don't care if we're talking Australia or the United States, everybody's in a crunch right now. So we all have to figure out ways to do this more efficiently and at a lower price point. And, quite frankly, there's a very low chance that some of the places I work are going to be able to develop a standardized participant program. But we may be able to bring SimConverse in, not to put you on the hot seat, but to put you on the hot seat. Do you think standardized participants still have a role? I mean, is it just for the physical exam? Or how do you talk to that? Yeah, I'm mainly speaking to medical schools, but how do you meet that question about whether there should still be standardized participants, which for our audience, those are trained actors, and participants is a more inclusive language that they could portray a patient. They could also portray a staff member, but essentially they're acting, and under the best circumstances, they're very well trained to be able to provide a similar experience for various learners, and in some situations debrief them as well and assist with the grading with them in some cases too.
That's the terminology that we should use earlier as well, the AI participant rather than maybe avatar. But I think I like that. I think you mentioned that to me when we were at IMSH. To answer the question though, so in terms of the importance of simulated patient actors or standardized participants, they absolutely have a place in curricula. So I am not of the mind that we should be replacing everything with technology. I think we have a habit as educators, and mainly the technology focused educators, of basically seeing something cool and shiny and trying to use it for absolutely everything, but technology doesn't belong everywhere. In terms of where we apply, this is a good opportunity for me to maybe briefly outline our pedagogy, because I think it shows exactly where at least I am and what we do, where we feel simulated participants best sit. Some work that I did really early on in my PhD was called stage-based learning theory. Stage-based learning theory is the idea that it's kind of basically simulation itself, but it's the idea that you can separate a complex skill into its individual component parts and train in on those component parts to get a better outcome for learners. That's been shown time and time again now. When I started it was a bit of an amalgamation of some of your audience. I know being in the US, you might actually be familiar with things like Sim zones theory and scaffolding and of course elements of Bloom's and Coles, but the main thing being basically split out how we think about our activity into its key components and focus in on that key component. By the way, if anyone who hasn't heard about it is listening, Sim zones theory is an excellent one to kind of structure some of your training around. It's out of, I think, Chris out of MIT and some work with CMS. So anyway, I digress on learning theory. The stage-based learning is a 3-step process. It's quite simple. It's about kind of applying this theory in practice. The first step is called foundation skill learning. That's kind of step one. Foundation skill learning, if people have heard the terminology, this is like where you have your flipped classroom. So this is kind of, I'm learning my theory, I'm reading textbooks, I'm watching videos maybe, but it's a very important first step. So I'm kind of knowing what I need to know before I go ahead and apply it. That's foundation skill learning. Step two is called component skill learning. Now, component skill, when we think about communication, you can split it into three key components: verbal, paraverbal, and non-verbal communication. Verbal is what you say, and I probably should have defined this earlier, but verbal is what you say. Paraverbal is how you say it, so your speech pattern, your tonality, your inflection. And the third is non-verbal communication, so body language, facial expression. Those are three separate component skills. What we focus on with what we do is verbal and paraverbal. Now, that's for all the reasons that you and I have already discussed around accessibility and actually increasing the scale of this training rather than just trying to do everything exactly like a real life practice, because we know that from all of the sim work that doesn't actually work. We've got to actually break these skills down. So we focus on verbal and paraverbal as step two for component skill learning. Non-verbals becomes very important when we talk about the third step, which is integration. So just to recap, step one is foundation skill learning. Step two is component skill learning, focusing on verbal and paraverbal communication with SimConverse. Step three is integration, which is, as the name would suggest, where you integrate this into the overall capability or skill. And this is where nonverbals becomes very important. This is also where you can't do this anywhere near the fidelity required unless you use real people. So that is either in a clinical or a ward environment, or it's with simulated participants. So kind of think of it as almost like you're scaffolding or building the learner up to develop this skill. This is sort of it's a bit of a no-brainer theory when we think about how we train literally any other skill in healthcare, but we haven't really had the opportunity to split this up to date with communication. Thankfully, with generative AI, one thing it is incredibly good at is making people think that they're talking to something that has sort of an intelligence behind it, right? That's also the exact same skill set or capability that you would require to set up a platform, i.e. SimConverse, to do this sort of training. So bit of a long form answer for you there, but where we see, or where I see in particular simulated participants sitting in, is as a very, very essential integration step. But what it means with technology now is that you don't have to maybe use them as far throughout the curriculum as you have, or you absolutely can, but it gives you an opportunity to maybe spend them a little bit more, spend that resource, which is very difficult to set up and very costly, in a more effective manner, because you don't have to do everything with simulated patients now. You can really bridge that gap. So kind of unlocks a whole suite of education opportunities that we wouldn't have previously been able to do. And rather than maybe giving learners one or two interactions with simulated participants throughout their course, throughout their year, or throughout their accrediting journey, you can give them the opportunity to talk to it many, many times, so that they actually do the repetitions and that they actually learn this particular skill. So that's sort of where I see simulated participants sitting in within the broader context of what technology can do today. Because like I said way earlier on in the podcast, I think educators should expect that if they're being told that something can be done, they should be able to see it. And this is what technology is currently capable of. You can't at the moment render 3D nonverbals in an effective manner, at least as far as all of the research is concerned and the hardware is concerned as well.
Oh my gosh, this has just been so helpful and so informative, and I think a really important primer on the upsides of generative AI, as we've been hearing so many potential downsides. You know, I highly recommend to the listeners, Brene Brown did an awesome 3-part series on AI. And she uses this analogy during the episode that, you know, we all, well, I say we, you're probably not as scared as AI since you knew about it longer than, you know, a lot of us. But learning this new technology, you know, I don't really remember when the internet came out. I mean, it just kind of was there in the background as I was growing up. So this is like a huge technological advancement that, I'm living through, right? And it feels scary, uncertain. And so this analogy of turning into the ice, that we're on the ice right now. And if you slam the brakes, it makes things worse. That's when you lose control of your car. Or for some of my listeners that aren't familiar with ice, when you're paddleboarding or surfing and a big wave's coming, and instead of moving away from it, you actually need to move into it so you don't get thrown off your board. So ice, ocean, whatever analogy is helpful. I think having conversations about this and learning more about it, that it's not a utopia, it's not a panacea, it's not going to solve every problem that we have. And I love what you said, that any tech person that's trying to say that isn't being truthful. So we do need that level of skepticism. But we've also got really hard jobs, and we have a lot of people that we're trying to train and get them to do. I mean, when you stop and think about it, we're trying to get learners to be able to talk with other humans at some of the most vulnerable, horrifying, scary, sometimes weird, awkward moments of life, and why we would just throw somebody into that versus if we had the option that they could practice even in the privacy of their own home. I mean, I remember the first time, you're in one of these standardized participants and it's like, gosh, I don't even know if I'm saying this right to this person. And now I know my professor's watching me have this conversation. So, I think in retrospect, it would have been great to have a few moments to practice something like this in a private environment and try to get the right, and not just, I say the right, you want to be able to say things in an authentic way. And, that's a lot of the conversations I have with learners is, this is the way I have learned to say this to a patient, but I need you to figure out the way that you can get the same message across in a way that's authentic to you and doesn't sound overly scripted or stulted, because people pick up on that too.
Absolutely. Yeah. Part of the way in which educators need technology to work for them is it needs to be flexible to the different ways in which people train. So there's that ties into exactly what you're referring to at the end there, where each person might refer to or have different techniques for communicating in complex situations, and you need to be able to accommodate for that. We knew that from the outset. So something that I haven't mentioned it so far, but something that we do is we have literally thousands of different scenarios set up on SimConverse, and every single one of them is flexible to the end use case, because each person trains slightly differently. Each accrediting standard is slightly different depending on where you are in the world. So being able to have that kind of flexibly work for you as an educator gives you the opportunity to go ahead and say, okay, I know communication is an incredibly complex and nuanced thing. I'm now giving my learners the opportunity to actually actively try these things out. And the phrase I usually refer to in my writing is the freedom to fail. So that's the other kind of big benefit to technology, is it meets people where they are rather than forcing them into uncomfortable situations, so that they can practice and actually improve, so that we can have a bit of an impact on communication more broadly, so that we can stop injuring both ourselves but also patients with poor communication. So I'm very, very passionate about it. I do appreciate you going to so many lengths to dig out some questions from me. It's been a really good conversation.
How can our listeners connect with you and learn more about SimConverse?
Yeah, so I'm happy to personally take any emails from people. So my email is will@simconverse.com. That's SIMCONVERSE.com. Equally, we have a website. So if you just search SimConverse, same spelling, into Google, you should be able to pop in. You'll see us right at the top, simconverse.com. There, so you can contact us either through me directly or through our website, and I'll do my best to reach out to anyone who mentions that they listen to Andrea's podcast.
Oh, fantastic. And I would highly recommend, in this situation, watching a demo is incredibly helpful. And we'll link to that in the show notes. But I would highly recommend that people check it out. And tell us, where can people find you this year? What conferences are you going to be attending?
Yeah, so most likely we'll be around AME, so AMEE over in Europe. I think they're in Switzerland this year. This is where I will be. And I'll also be at ASPE later in the year in the UK, which is, I can't remember what the acronym stands for. It's a simulated patient conference at the end of 2024. And then I'll be back at IMSH again, of course, at the start of 2025, because that's just such an excellent conference.
Awesome. Yeah, you've just pushed me. I'm on my life goals is getting to the European Sim conference. I don't think I'll make it this year unless somebody wants to miraculously fund me. But I will definitely be at IMSH. I'd encourage the listeners to go to that. It's in Orlando this year, and 2025, which is weird to say. But thank you so much. Thank you for your innovation, your courage, your tenacity, and doing something different. I I learned a lot about you today, and I'm glad that you are doing something different, because there will be somebody that will fill another spot in medical school. I'm not sure if there's anybody that's going to be building a company like yours. And honestly, that was at the right time, because you did it before ChatGPT had taken off. And so I'm just really thankful for the courage and all that you're doing to make communication better.
Well, thank you so much. It's an easy thing to do when you're doing something you love, but I'm sure it's the same with your podcasting. So thank you for having me on, and I look forward to hearing from anyone who's listened in and wants some questions answered.
Awesome. Thank you, Will.
Thanks, Andrea. Cheers.